Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. Financial tremors in Turkey shake investor sentiment. We'll take a look at whether it could be spreading across emerging markets. Also this week, South Africa's rand takes a beating, while a perfect storm of factors, including land reform, is hitting Africa's most developed economy. Plus, why Google is tracking your every move, even when you tell it to stop. But the collapse of the Turkish lira was a big worry for investors around the globe this week. The currency crisis came to a head after a feud with the world's biggest economy. The spat with the United States, a long-time NATO ally, isn't over yet. On Wednesday, Turkey said it is putting retaliatory tariffs on imports of certain US products. Economists say Turkey's central bank needs to raise interest rates significantly to strengthen its currency. But that's something Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan doesn't want to do. In the meantime, Qatar, a strong ally of Turkey, has pledged $15 billion in direct investment in the country. Sinem Koseoglu has more from Istanbul.
Qatar Emir's visit to Turkey wasn't a random working visit. It was right in the midst of the crisis of political tensions between United States and Turkey, and it was also the time when the Turkish lira was losing value. So it was important that he pledged this 15 billion worth foreign direct investment package. For now, we don't know the details of this investment package, but it was a sign for both Turkish domestic markets and the international markets that a huge fund Qatar has confidence in the Turkish markets. Of course, Qatar has some more investments in Turkey, at least worth $20 billion of investments in from media to entertainment, construction, infrastructure. Already Turkey and Qatar has a strong economic cooperation, and almost 2 years ago, QNB, Qatar National Bank, acquired one of the biggest banks of Turkey, Finance Bank. And the bank actually is planning to expand in the next couple of years more, and it is the biggest third loan lender in Turkey. So Qatar already is a very important investor in Turkey, even planning to expand more.
Let's take a step back and talk about the Turkey effect. Emerging market currencies from India to Argentina to Indonesia hit major lows. Why is this? Well, Turkey's economy is relatively small. It only accounts for about 1% of global gross domestic product. To find the answer, we have to go back nearly a decade ago. After the end of the global financial crisis, record low interest rates in the developed world meant it was cheaper for developing nations to borrow in dollars or euros. About $40 trillion was added to the debts of emerging markets since then. That's according to the Institute of International Finance. But we are now entering an era in which central banks like the US Federal Reserve aren't keeping rates low anymore. And that's lending support to the dollar. So as the dollar rises, it is now costing those developing countries a lot more to repay their debts. Well, joining us now from London is Timothy Ash, a senior emerging markets sovereign strategist with London-based Blue Bay Asset Management. Thanks very much for being with us. So things look to have stabilized for now, and the financial boost from Qatar is a big help. But what effect will this have? Is Turkey out of the woods yet?
The central bank, which had been very inactive in the period since July 24th when they failed to raise rates, which really was a spur for the big pressure on the lira that we've seen in recent weeks. Central bank really began to fight. I mean, it began to tighten liquidity both onshore and offshore. We have the good news about the Qatari support, which is positive. They could have come out on Monday with an announcement of capital controls. They probably thought about it and thought, this is not really a very good idea. This is not going to help us. It's not going to help Turkish business. And that's a positive. But they still face big challenges. The economy is still overheating. There's a big pressure from inflation. Policy credibility is pretty low still. And they have the problems still with the relationship with the US that really does need resolving.
And this seems to be part of a worldwide trend with emerging markets. Argentina's having problems, Indonesia, South Africa, the list goes on. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I guess we came into the year with the expectation of Fed policy tightening. We saw some policy errors in Argentina and obviously then in Turkey. and you know, a combination of individual country stories that have been quite challenging, plus Fed tightening, and then obviously a difficult geopolitical backdrop with Trump on trade, obviously problems with China. You know, that's made people, you know, somewhat nervous around EM. The positives, I think, is that you know, EM currencies have adjusted. You know, the times when emerging market ran fixed exchange rates is pretty much over in terms of big liquid markets. Currencies have adjusted. That will help them, you know, if global growth slows and trade slows as well. Generally, policymakers have been pretty orthodox in terms of policy responses. I mean, Turkey would be the exception, but generally policymakers have hiked rates. And so far, oil has held in pretty well. And remember, a large part of the EM asset class is really oil and commodities. Metals are not struggling at the moment. That is a challenge, but oil's doing okay.
How big a problem is debt in all of this then?
Clearly, the positive about FX adjustments in emerging markets, that helps the real economy. But big foreign exchange moves then you know, puts the spotlight on countries with a lot of gross external debt, foreign debt. The encouraging factor is so far we haven't seen any major emerging market go down a debt restructuring default scenario. Been a lot of pressure on Turkey, but they've survived so far. Willingness to pay is pretty high. They have options, as you know, as noted earlier in terms of the Qatari support. So countries are riding through it so far. But you know, it really does depend on, you know, if we see a further deterioration in US-China trade relations, global growth begins to suffer, global, obviously on the back of trade, you know, trade tightening, and then oil and commodities take a step lower. I think that would change the whole outlook for emerging markets more fundamentally.
And when you look at Turkey, particularly those that trade a great deal with the country and have large investments in it, how exposed are they to Turkey's problems, do you think?
Well, in terms of contagion, you know, Turkey is a big trading partner of many countries. If you look at, you know, it's quite interesting, but Erdogan has spoken about a reorientation east, given the challenges in terms of the US relationship. And the Qatari support is useful. But in the end, 2/3 of Turkey's trade, investment and financing is from the West. So whatever Erdogan may say about this reorientation, it's really important to normalize the relationship with the West, because ultimately, you know, what happens in Turkey will be determined about his ability to encourage, you know, international banks, mostly Western, and international institutional investors, portfolio investors, to keep their money in Turkey. And you know, again, it's really important, I think, that relationship with the US is normalized as soon as possible.
All right, Timothy Ash, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost, a 300-year-old Spanish ship is found off the coast of Colombia, but who gets all its sunken treasure is the big question. But first, an Associated Press investigation this week revealed that Google is tracking your mobile phone even when the location setting is turned off. Companies like Google make billions of dollars from selling information about our every move to advertisers, data like our exact location. Google did not deny it was tracking users' movements. It said it provides clear descriptions of its tools to consumers. Argentina already had the highest interest rates in the world, and it's decided to hike them even higher. On Monday, it raised interest rates by 5% to a record 45%. The central bank is trying to combat a currency sell-off, concerns over a local corruption scandal, and this week's turmoil in emerging markets set off the latest drop. The lack of women in key senior corporate roles at the UK's largest public companies was highlighted this week. A report released Wednesday showed just 7 FTSE 100 CEOs are women. The report pointed out that CEOs of the largest London-listed companies are as likely to be named Dave as they are to be female. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa is staking his reputation on trying to revive the economy ahead of next year's national elections. But last week's plan to overhaul how land is owned in the country has alarmed some investors. Although apartheid ended almost 25 years ago, South African society remains one of the most unequal in the world, and it's made matters like land rights a burning issue. Famina Miller has more from Stellenbosch.
Slivers of light shine through the simply furnished home of Nokwandisa Kwetana. She's been living on this land illegally for 3 weeks. There are dozens more roughly built homes dotted across this hill in Stellenbosch near Cape Town, an area known for its affluent vineyards and estates.
It's because of our government that we are here. We have asked for land before, but they have not helped us. We have to make a lot of noise and fight to get this land here.
A court has ordered that no more homes can be built here and those that are unoccupied be destroyed. But as night falls, people scurry to bring in more building material.
This is our land that was taken from our ancestors. Even though the current owner bought this land, the previous owner stole this land. And so now it needs to be returned to us. We are taking the land.
According to government statistics, South Africa's white minority population owns more than 70% of privately owned farming land. Under political and public pressure to reform land ownership, the ruling African National Congress says it will support moves to change the constitution to allow the seizure of land, as long as it does not harm the agricultural sector or the economy. But it's unclear how this will be done and who will qualify for the land. While acknowledging the need for urgent land reform, President Cyril Ramaphosa appears to be struggling with a balancing act. This week, while addressing investors, he said the government would not allow land grabs and anarchy, wanting to calm the fears of the business community. But deciding between what landless people need and what investors want may not make everyone happy. The government says it plans to seize 139 farms across South Africa before the constitution is changed. If successful, amendments to the constitution could be avoided. There are fears seizing land without compensation could scare off investors, violate property rights and hurt food production. Critics say talk around land expropriation is a ploy for votes ahead of next year's elections, rather than a sincere attempt to reform land ownership, and that expectations should be managed. Meanwhile, people here could face eviction as the landowner returns to court in the coming weeks to have them removed.
Well, joining me now from London is John Ashbourne, a senior emerging markets economist at Capital Economics. Thanks very much for being with us. So this sell-off in emerging markets couldn't have come at a worse time, could it, for South Africa with all the other problems that it's dealing with?
It certainly is a difficult time for South Africa, and coming after a period when there was such optimism. They had the change in president, obviously, in February, and there was a hope that this would put a difficult period behind the country, and that doesn't seem to have happened.
And why do you think that is?
There's a realization, I think, now that many of the problems faced by South Africa are serious structural issues, and it's going to take more than just a new president to address them, even if President Ramaphosa is making some positive steps in some directions, particularly in personnel changes at state enterprises. It isn't possible in only a few months to turn things around. And so that has led to, I think, a bit more of an understanding of the situation faced in South Africa. And then, of course, this recent fall in the rand has been due to something entirely unrelated to South Africa, a situation in Turkey. Because while even if South Africa is improving, it's still vulnerable to problems elsewhere in the world.
And what implications does this land reform plan have for South Africa's economy? How is it being viewed there? Is there a fear that it could we could end up with the chaos that Zimbabwe went through several years ago?
Well, I think Zimbabwe is probably more than a worst-case scenario. I think things getting that far is very, very unlikely. What's going on right now, though, is a significant amount of indecision and of lack of clarity. It simply isn't known right now exactly what the government's plan will be. There have been leaks, suggestions of different bits of land being taken or not. And so right now, people honestly don't know what's going to happen, and that's led to a great deal of worry in the markets. Our view, and I think the view of many analysts, is that at the end of the day, the ANC isn't going to go crazy. They aren't going to do the sort of thing that happened in Zimbabwe. They know what the result of that would be. And so we'll probably see some kind of compromise and a slow legalistic process. They're talking about changing the constitution. There'll be debates in parliament. There'll be new laws. Where exactly that goes isn't exactly clear, but probably a series of small steps. And it is also worth keeping in mind that agriculture is only about 2% of the economy of South Africa. So while this makes huge headlines, and it's very emotive, rightly, for a lot of people, this isn't going to be what changes the direction of the South African economy. What's much more important in that country is what's happening in mining, what's happening in manufacturing, what's happening in the retail sector generally.
And where does South Africa fit globally in terms of what's happening across emerging markets in the world right now?
Well, it's been a very bad week, a very difficult week, we could say, for emerging markets generally. And South Africa has been one of the most affected by that. And some of that is because South Africa has some domestic fragilities. It has problems with its current account deficit and so on. But part of it is that South Africa, because it's an accessible market and easily tradable currency, it's always more affected by factors going on in the global economy than other less integrated economies. So if you look at another African country like Kenya or like Nigeria, they just don't have the sort of financial connections to the rest of the world that allow them to be harmed by crises that are happening in Europe or in Asia. So South Africa is in some ways a victim of its success because it's a more integrated, more globalized economy. It therefore feels the harm of that when you see investors, as they have been doing this past week, pull out of emerging markets, become scared by what's happening in Turkey and elsewhere. So South Africa is, in this case, the victim of bad luck. This isn't really a problem of their own creation, but because of the way their economy works, they've been much more hard hit by that than have economies elsewhere.
And how are foreign investors in South Africa, or potential foreign investors, likely to view this whole issue of land reform and the lack of clarity around it right now?
Well, the lack of clarity is certainly bad for investment. People don't really know what's going to happen, and they don't know as well what the end of this process will be. So the Constitution refers to the confiscation of property, and currently we're only discussing agricultural land. That's where the debates happened. But if the law is changed, could the same laws be used or applied to mines or to other industrial assets? It's really not clear. So I think when we do actually get a draft of a constitutional change, then there'll be some clarity, and we expect that draft change will be relatively incremental, and that will cause people to calm down. Of course, if the change is more than what people think, then we'll see another big drop in confidence and more worries. But right now, I think many investors in South Africa are at least as worried about the economy generally. I mean, we had the economy contracting in Q1, and the numbers we have suggest that things were pretty much flat at best in Q2. So this is an economy that might be in a technical recession, that's having significant issues and concerns about corruption. There are a lot of things to worry about even before we get to the land issue. So it's only adding to that, which is worrying people.
There is also this sovereign wealth fund proposal that the government is talking about. And given the problems that you've just highlighted there, what are the prospects for that?
Well, there isn't, to be frank, much sovereign wealth to put into any kind of fund they put together. So it would be a limited effect. But at the moment, there are several different funds and different ways that the government sort of marshals its assets, and consolidating them into one, even if it wouldn't be very big by the scale of Qatar or countries like that, is still probably administratively a good step. But I really doubt it will be a big enough or sort of strategic enough to have a significant effect on the economy, even though it's an economy that does need investment. South Africa just doesn't have the kind of revenue, the kind of stored up wealth to create one of these huge funds in the way that you see in the Middle Eastern countries or in places like Singapore.
Good to speak with you, John Ashbourne. Now, there have been allegations of fraud on a Kenyan infrastructure project that was welcomed with fanfare just a year ago. The railway, which was funded by China, connects the capital Nairobi with the port city of Mombasa. Catherine Soy has the details.
This is the latest corruption case involving the construction of a railway line in Kenya, the biggest and most expensive infrastructure project in the country at the moment. The heads of the National Land Commission, the State Railway and other business people have pleaded not guilty to 19 charges including fraud, corruption and abuse of office. They're accused of authorizing payments for compensation of land used in the construction of a section of the railway, about $3 million paid to people or for land that did not exist or that was already owned by the Railways Corporation. This year, the government has intensified its crackdown on corruption in a way Kenyans have not seen in a long time.
No matter how powerful you think you are, no matter how much you think you know people in high position, no matter how much money you have, that will not save you.
Corruption has been a major concern. Multi-million-dollar scandals have been unearthed in several public offices. Government officials, politicians, and powerful business people have been implicated. Some have been brought to court. A report by the Auditor General's office shows that a third of the country's budget is lost to corruption and mismanagement every year.
Part of why I'm optimistic is that for the first time, it's not just the job of the Director of Public Prosecutions or the Anti-Corruption Commission. It's a multi-agency, so we're going at this with everything that we have.
And in the spirit of the crackdown, demolitions of buildings on road reserves and riparian land said to have been acquired fraudulently is ongoing.
So this is one of the buildings worth millions of dollars that have been brought down by the government in the last few weeks. It sits right next to an important stream. The next one to go is Oswald Center there. The owners have already started bringing down the parts that are earmarked for demolition.
This is President Uhuru Kenyatta's last term in office, and he's promised more jobs through the manufacturing industry, universal health care, affordable housing and food security. For that to happen, he needs to deal decisively with corruption.
I think he understands that this is the only chance that he has to basically break away from the past, which is basically, I break the law, but I have friends in high places. I make a phone call and it's just going to go away.
Many Kenyans say they're happy with what they're seeing. They're, however, also calling for speedy trials, convictions, and the assets of those found guilty to be confiscated.
Finally, Colombia's government is blocking treasure hunters from salvaging what they're calling the holy grail of shipwrecks. When the Spanish San Jose galleon sank more than 300 years ago, it was thought to be filled with gold and precious stones, a cargo that will be worth billions today. But as Manuel Rapallo reports, it is unclear who will get the treasure once it's brought ashore.
Stories of shipwrecks and sunken treasure have long captivated the imagination. But perhaps no wreck has fascinated underwater archaeologists and treasure hunters quite like the San Jose. Attacked by Britain's Royal Navy in 1708 during a battle off the coast of Cartagena, Colombia, all but 7 members of her crew went down with the ship.
Unfortunately, the San Jose was too heavy to maneuver itself against the attack and was sunk by the British.
3 years ago, former Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos announced his government had found the fabled galleon. With the aid of unmanned submersibles, 3D mapping technology, state-of-the-art robotics, and an international team of experts, the San Jose was found. The catch is, a company called Sea Search Armada claimed they had found the ship more than 35 years ago and have been locked in a fierce legal battle with the Colombian government over their share of the treasure. A treasure that today is valued up to $20 billion.
Hay de todo, el manifiesto de carga.
It had everything. The cargo manifest lists gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, all of the wealth and taxes collected over 6 years from Colombia, Panama, and Peru.
Nelson Padilla literally wrote the book on the San Jose. He says there are several parties who have a legitimate claim to ownership over the treasure.
España.
The Spain because it was a Spanish ship, Peru because most of the cargo was Peruvian, Panama because part of the cargo was Panamanian, and Colombia because the ship was found in our waters.
It's believed there are more than 1,000 sunken Spanish galleons off the coast of Colombia alone. According to UNESCO, there's an estimated 3 million shipwrecks all around the world still waiting to be discovered. Apart from the treasure, the cultural value of many of these vessels is immeasurable. Antonio Rengifo, an expert in maritime law, says the case of the San Jose could set a precedent for future disputes over sunken treasure.
All of the countries involved could set up an example of a historic cultural dialogue that would serve the world in similar situations.
With so much at stake over the ownership of the treasure, recovery efforts have been put on hold indefinitely, leaving some here to wonder how much longer they'll have to wait before the treasure of the San Jose surfaces again.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazem Seeker. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. So that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.